If you would like to support the podcast, you can click the Buy Us a Coffee link on our show notes or on our website. Your support helps us keep the podcast going, and we appreciate each of our listeners so much.
You can also rate and review us on Apple and Spotify, follow us on social media, and don't forget to tell your friends and family about us. I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is Hard Times and True Crimes.
Prior to the 1850s, the purpose of locking a person up was to detain them while they awaited punishment for whatever crime they had committed. It was not a long-term plan, just a way to house the criminal until they were subjected to either corporal punishment, a beating, or capital punishment, put to death. But over time, some became opposed to the death penalty, and the idea of being imprisoned as a punishment for crime took hold. By the mid-19th century, penitentiaries were being used to hold prisoners for their crimes, not just waiting for the real punishment. It was the punishment, and conditions were not always humane. Of course, there were overcrowding, and with that came rampant disease. And because many times people in power became corrupt, there was often mistreatment of prisoners by wardens and guards. That's in addition to the abuse between prisoners themselves. The death toll was high in prison, even if you weren't facing the death penalty. With the idea of using prison as a reform, some inmates were housed for life, but the hope was that the fear of being locked away and losing freedom would inspire penance and true regret in the heart of the prisoners, thereby deterring prisoners from continuing their life of crime. And the system implemented education, work programs, and religious materials, all in their efforts to curb criminal behavior. Of course, this was not always the result. In fact, as many argued, the time spent in close proximity with other criminals for lengthy periods of time sometimes had the opposite effect of influencing more bad choices, causing some inmates to commit to a life of crime. The state penitentiary at Anamosa in Iowa, built in 1874, was an overflow to reduce the overcrowding at Fort Madison. It was first known as the Additional Penitentiary for the state. It used inmate work programs as a reform, with the goal of making offenders employable once released. This reform produced varying degrees of success, depending on who you talk to. By the time our prisoner entered Anamosa, intermediate sentencing and early release was gaining favor among some of those in authority, and Anamosa had implemented a grading system. Early release was more likely if the prisoner could show moral progress was being made, and today the ladies will tell you about one such inmate.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How's everything going?
Good. Really good.
Would you like to tell our listeners why we are not drinking coffee this morning?
We're going to go donate blood.
But to be exact, plasma.
So that we have to be super hydrated.
Right. So we're both drinking water this morning.
Yes.
Spring water, actually.
Yep, because supposedly it hydrates you more than purified water. If that's true or not, I have no idea, but I've heard it over and over again lately.
It's worth a try, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so that's where we're going right after we record today. So let's jump in.
Okay.
My sources for today's episode, of course, will be listed in the show notes. In the mid-morning hours of July 16th, 1889, a horrible double murder took place in Elk Township of Iowa. John Elkins, aged 45, and his wife, Hattie, aged 22, were found brutally killed in their home by their 11-year-old son, John Wesley Elkins.
Oh, my gosh.
The Elkins family consisted of John and his third wife, Hattie, and their 13-month-old daughter. They had been married approximately 4 years. John had two sons, one aged 23, whom he was known to quarrel with frequently, Therefore, that son was actually staying away from home most of the time at a residence about a mile away. The other son was 11-year-old Wesley, who discovered the murders. John, Hattie, Wesley, and the baby resided as tenants on the farm of Alan Porter.
The baby was left alive, though?
Yes, the baby was alive, and it was a little girl.
Okay.
So Wesley had gone to sleep in the barn that night because it was cooler out there. He reported that sometime between 2 and 3 a.m., he heard a gunshot but was afraid to go investigate. So he waited about half an hour before he ventured into the house. Mm-hmm. And when he got there, he found his father had been shot through the head and his stepmother had been brutally beaten about the head. Mm-hmm. His infant sister was lying next to the deceased couple, according to young Wesley. When authorities arrived and did an initial search, they found that Mr. Elkins was dead from one gunshot to the head. The ball from the rifle had gone through his skull and was embedded in his pillow. It was determined that the shot had come from his own rifle, which had then been replaced in its place back on the wall.
Okay.
And he had also suffered some head damage from being beaten as well. The wife was found draped across her husband's body on the bed, her feet touching the floor. She had been bludgeoned. One newspaper reported that her head was crushed almost into a jelly.
Wow. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So, as you can imagine, there was blood everywhere. The bed, the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Mm-hmm. Furniture in the bedroom was broken and displaced. So it was apparent that she had fought hard to preserve her own life. The scene was just gruesome. Later, the stick or the club, which was about 4 feet long and 1.5 inches thick, the one that had been used to beat Hattie, was found about 40 feet from the house, and it was covered in blood and brain matter.
Gosh.
Can you imagine?
That's awful. And
being a child and discovering that.
11 years old?
Right.
No, I can't.
Early on, authorities suspected the 23-year-old son of the crime. Mm-hmm. Some people even suspected that maybe he had help from his 11-year-old brother, Wesley, because both had been known to be at odds with their father's wife, Hattie. And then there was some suspicion that a cousin may have been the perpetrator, just based on the initial testimony of that young Wesley himself.
Okay.
Another possibility was that the crime was committed during a robbery, because Mr. Elkins had recently come into some cash of about $300, which could not be located at the house. On July 23rd, Governor Larrabee of Iowa offered a $500 reward for the arrest and delivery of the person or persons who committed the murders. The sheriff even hired detectives of the Pinkerton Agency out of Chicago to help with the case.
Okay, so it was a big deal.
One source reported that the sheriff had actually brought the young boy, Wesley, to live with him in order to shield him from the public.
Oh, wow.
I thought that was a good man to do that. And of course, while he was there, he held many conversations with Wesley during that time. And it was during one of those conversations that led to a confession by the boy.
Wow.
On July 26th, the confession was repeated to Judge Hatch.
Okay.
The 11-year-old admitted to being the one that killed his father and stepmother.
Oh, my goodness.
His story as related to Judge Hatch was this. He said that he and his father had some sort of a quarrel the evening before, and Wesley had gone to sleep in the barn. Between 2 and 3 a.m., he arose from the bed and went into the house, took his father's rifle from off the wall, which was at the foot of Wesley's bed in his bedroom. Mm-hmm. He went into his parents' bedroom and fired the shot that killed his father. His stepmother, Hattie, was awakened by the shot.
Right.
Wesley went and rehung the gun in its place and then got a club that he had in the house. He found his stepmother crouching over the bed and proceeded to use the club to beat her on the head until dead.
Oh, my goodness.
He waited around the house for close to half an hour, at which point he removed the blood-splattered clothes from his baby sister and then took her to the nearest neighbor, where he reported the crime, stating that he had fled with the baby to preserve both of their lives.
Was he even a suspect?
Yes. Early on, it was reported in the papers that he and his brother both were suspects in the crime, and there were people who suspected him quite early.
That's right, because he or his older brother didn't get along with the stepmother.
Right.
Okay.
So even like within just a couple of days of the murders being discovered, there were newspaper reports that he was a suspect.
But apparently the cops must not have been convinced of that if they're letting him come and stay at their house.
Right. The sheriff did, or maybe
it was a tactic.
Maybe it was a tactic.
Yeah.
Maybe he was a really smart man and thought, well, he probably did think he should protect him as well.
Right.
Because he's a kid.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he probably did think, hey, maybe I can get him to confess or at least tell on his brother.
That's true. Yeah.
When he was asked what his motive was for the brutal deed, he replied that he wanted the freedom to do what he wanted, and he was tired of doing chores.
Oh, my goodness.
Other reports say that he also had at one point claimed he felt he was having to mind the baby too often.
Wow. Okay.
Shortly after that confession, the young Elkins was taken to jail in Clayton County, Iowa. After Wesley's confession, there were some who felt that at this young age that he was confessing in order to shield someone else from the blame.
Mm-hmm.
Probably, most likely, his older brother. So even then, people didn't quite believe it because he was so young.
He was so young, yeah.
And that was such a brutal murder. They were like, yeah, that's not...
He couldn't have done that.
Right. However, he maintained that it was him and him alone who had committed that atrocity.
Mm.
The coroner's grand jury convened to decide his fate. After a long investigation, in October of 1889, which was a few months after the deed, they returned an indictment against Wesley Elkins Jr. of the murders based on the only evidence, his own written statement. So, Darlene, I have a copy of that written statement here, and I'm going to have you read it for us.
Okay.
It's from the Council Bluffs Daily Nonpareil, dated October 22nd, 1889.
The District Court of Clayton County has adjourned. The grand jury returned an indictment against Wesley Elkins, the 11-year-old boy who cruelly murdered his parents last July, 5 miles northeast of Englewood. There was no evidence against him except his own statement in writing, which is as follows. I was sleeping at the barn, and I wanted to get away from home. I had run away from home a number of times, but they brought me back. I thought I would kill them, so I went up to the house just before sunrise on the morning of July 16th and went softly into the house to see if my parents were asleep. I peeked into their bedroom and saw that they were fast asleep. I then went to the road in front of the house to see if anybody was coming, and finding the coast clear, I went to the corn crib and got the club, which was a part of a flail, and then went into the house softly and put the club in my bedroom and set it down. I then took my father's rifle, which was always hung up in my room, loaded, and stepped out of my bedroom around to father's, and his door being open, I put the gun to his face and fired. Wow. I immediately went back for my club, knowing that I would not have time to load the gun. I got the club, and when I got back to the door, Mother was upon the floor and stooped over doing something. I thought perhaps she was looking at Father, who lay in the front side of the bed. I struck her on the head as she was stooping, and she straightened up and fell backward on the bed and over Father. I then got up on the bed and struck her a great many times on the head until I thought she was dead. Then I heard Father make a noise in his throat, and I struck him 2 blows on the head and smashed the skull. I then took the baby and hitched up the horse and started for Grandpa's. Nobody helped in any way or told me to kill them. I did it all alone. The boy is a very intelligent little fellow, only weighing 73 pounds, and is very frail looking. Whoa.
Wow. What do you think of that?
I think that he sounds like a cold-blooded killer.
I know. I mean,
and that's just hard to reconcile that he's 11 years old.
Right. It really, when you read it in his own words, it's
very
chilling. On January 11th, 1890, Wesley pleaded guilty in court before the Honorable Judge Hoyt in Elkader, Iowa, and was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of his father and stepmother, making him the youngest person to be sent to prison at that time.
Yeah, I bet.
Shortly afterward, the small-statured boy was sent to Anamosa State Penitentiary to live out the remainder of his days with hard labor. He was known inside prison walls only as prisoner number 1900, but outside the prison, his fame was that of boy murderer. When the Fayette County Leader reported their latest law log, they listed his sentence in their report on January 17. In it, they felt none too sorry for this boy, writing, "The last culprit is the youngest and most villainous on record, and it is a pity to put the state to any expense on his account."
Oh, so they thought he should have been executed.
Oh, and they go on to say, "He ought to have been hung up by his ankles and let the buzzards finish the job."
Whoa. Whoa. Okay.
So they spared no...
Yeah, they didn't have any care that he was 11.
They did not. Now, not everyone held such sentiments about this. Just a month after sentencing the boy, he was visited in prison by Reverend S.S. Hunting, president of the Iowa Prisoners' Aid Association, who sat and talked with Elkins for some time. During this conversation, Wesley alleged to the Reverend that his father was harsh with him and very cruel. Many times at night, he would lie there and fantasize about killing his father, until one night he said he snapped and actually committed the horrendous deed. He said that he only killed his stepmother for fear she would tell on him. Reverend Hunting felt so strongly that this young boy should be sent to a reform institution as opposed to a prison, where he was surrounded by hardened criminals. And here we have a social dilemma.
Right.
There were very strong feelings on both sides of this issue pertaining to the boy's life sentence. On the one hand, there were the residents of rural Clayton County where the crime had taken place. They asserted that he had always shown bad morals and had been born into a life of violent tendencies. While his nature could be tamed at times or hidden, they didn't see that it was redeemable, and they were unashamedly opposed to his release. Their view was that criminal behavior was an inherited trait, that this act of parricide was due to uncontrollable urges and a degenerate heart. And of course, we know that is based in truth to some extent for all of us, right? I mean, we are all born with a degenerate heart.
Yeah.
So the history of this, why they feel that he was born into this, is this. John Elkins, the father, had been married to Wesley's biological mother, living at their farm in Clayton County prior to Wesley's birth. His wife was named Matilda Blackwell. While she was married to John Elkins, she had an adulterous affair. At some point, she decided she needed to kill her husband. Some of the rumors about this tell of a time when she got a shotgun and waited for him to come along the road, intending to kill him by ambush. But some other folks came along and she started worrying they had seen her. So she gave up on her plan at that moment for fear of being caught. Then again, there are reports that she had conspired with a hired hand, some say that was her lover, to help her roll a huge log down onto her husband as he worked. Another time, it is said that she waited once for him to return from town, plotting to stab him through with a pitchfork.
Sheesh.
Right? For whatever reason, she didn't carry through with that plan either. Lastly, she plotted to kill him in his sleep by a gunshot and then fetch the neighbors claiming they had been robbed. Right.
Okay.
Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
All of those tales are just that. They are stories that the neighboring farmers were aware of, and, you know, they had probably spread among themselves. Probably some of them had heard it. I think at some point, one of the neighbors said, you know, she had told them of those plans.
Right.
And so then, of course, they're telling the other neighbors. So the neighbors wholeheartedly believed those tales, whether they were true or not, or whether they just had a grain of truth.
Now, did all this come out at the boy's trial?
Yes, and later on, after his trial as well. And I'll get to that.
Okay.
We don't know why none of her attempts or plans came to fruition, or even if she actually ever attempted or just talked about it. But, you know, when people talk, things tend to grow out of proportion, and, you know, who knows how much of that was rumor and how much was true.
Right, that's what I was thinking.
She did eventually leave her husband and run off to Waterloo with her lover. It is said that she gave birth to little Wesley just a few months later. So the neighbors...
After she left?
Yes.
Okay.
The neighbors felt like he's born into this murder plot because she was pregnant with him while she was making all these plans, and that he had inherited those thoughts from his mother, so to speak.
Okay.
Wesley was raised by his mother and her new husband until he was 7 years old. I'm sure during those years, she probably talked about how I was going to do this to your father or that.
Right.
Because some people are like that. They don't care that you're a child. They're going to say whatever they want about their ex.
Exactly.
And so I'm sure over the years, he did grow up hearing stories.
Those things. Do we know if he had a relationship with his biological father during those 7 years?
He did not.
Okay.
During those 7 years.
Okay.
But at the tender young age of 7, his mother passed away, and apparently his stepfather didn't want to raise a child that was not his, so he sent him away and sent him back to his dad.
Okay.
And that's how young Wesley ended up back in Clayton County with his biological father, whom he had not really had a relationship with prior to.
Okay.
By this time, his father is remarried a third time, and he has a new baby girl with his new wife. And so now Wesley has a new stepmother.
Wow, this case it's interesting.
Yeah. But on the other side of the aisle, you have people who feel that this young boy doesn't even stand a chance at redemption if he's going to be locked away with criminals for the rest of his life. Mm-hmm. And in their opinion, he's just a child who made a bad decision due to harsh upbringing, immaturity of the mind. Some people felt like he was treated cruelly by his father and stepmother.
I can see that, especially given the history with his mother. If the dad harbored these ill feelings toward his mother, he could feel the same way. Not the same way, but he could not have great feelings about his son.
And I'm sure the stepmother, here you have this boy of 7 years old who you've probably never met show up at your door.
Yeah.
And you've got a baby and your husband. Maybe you don't want that intrusion. You're probably not going to be so nice.
Right. So he probably wasn't very wanted. And then too, okay, but this is no excuse. But also, there was probably no bond there between father and son.
Which may make it easier for him to commit such a deed if you don't have a bond with somebody. Is that what you're... Yeah.
If he's mean to you, you don't have a bond. No telling the things that he grew up hearing from his mom.
A lot of things.
Yes.
So those people on that side of the argument here, they feel like that imprisoning him for life is an injustice. And they feel like it's morally wrong on the part of people who are fighting for it as well.
Okay.
Oh, and they had not fought for the death penalty because he was a child. So that was kind
of taken
off the table. And I do feel like that was probably the right decision. So now the social dilemma just comes down to basically, should he be imprisoned for the rest of his life?
Right. Because if it were today, he wouldn't be.
Exactly. And actually, if it were today, I don't think he would be put into a prison with grown men either.
Absolutely not.
But at this point, he was put into the general population.
Okay.
As soon as he entered Iowa's largest prison, he was assigned to work in the library. The warden even pitied this young man and kept him under close supervision.
Wow.
He also did what he could to keep him separate from the older inmates as much as he could. Again, he is in the general population, but he's trying to protect him. Warden Barr felt strongly that this young boy could be rehabilitated and his young mind could be shaped into a moral member of society. Fortunately for Wesley, when Warden Barr left in 1892 and was replaced with Warden Madden, that warden also felt the same way. He also went out of his way to protect the young prisoner. I've always kind of thought in my head, the picture was all these wardens were exceptionally cruel,
Yeah.
But that's just based on movies that I've watched, right?
True.
And so to hear that both of these men were trying to protect him, I thought, well, that's I felt that was good. By all accounts, Wesley was an intellectual young man, and he did well in the library, reading whatever and whenever he could. He was also given an education by prison chaplains and others. And although by his own admission, he never had an easy time understanding math, he became quite good at the spoken and written word. And it was not long before he began to write letters on his own behalf seeking a pardon. Now, remember, we've talked about this before, and I know you know it, But a pardon does not clear your criminal record.
Right.
It just puts forth that the offender has worked hard to become a law-abiding citizen.
Yeah.
And that's what he's arguing for.
Okay.
Wesley's only hope for early release was to get a pardon from the governor of the state. In the state of Iowa, in cases of first-degree murder, the governor was required to run pardon petitions through the General Assembly after notifying the public. Oh, and I wanted to go back and note, when they charged him for the murders, they actually only tried him for the murder of his father.
Okay.
And it was that same tactic that we've seen before in other cases. Because if he had gotten away with that, then they could go back and try him for the murder of the stepmother.
Okay.
Wesley's first request for pardon was in 1895, and he was 18 at this time. His reasons cited were his age at the time of the crime and that his time served should already be sufficient punishment. Some witnesses describe him as a model prisoner, obedient, studious, kind, and yet others would tell an opposing tale, painting him as belligerent, spiteful, claiming that even some of the fellow inmates were fearful of him. I know, I thought that was weird when I read it.
Especially given his age.
But maybe as he grew up, was around hardened criminals, he probably did have to develop a tough veneer.
Sure.
To survive in there.
Yeah.
So maybe, sometimes it's kill or be killed, or,
right.
You know what I'm saying? So maybe he had developed that tough exterior. But even as he sought a pardon for his crime, he remained unemotional when speaking about it. He didn't seem remorseful to many people. It's worth noting he never tried to deny the crime after that was first found out. But after he gave that confession, he never retracted that confession and never tried to deny his guilt. He just sought mercy on the grounds of being just a child of 11 when the double murder was committed. As in most of the cases we've covered, it became a media sensation.
Right.
It all plays out in the media. And in those days, the media was the newspaper.
Okay.
We didn't have the TVs and all of that going on. It was the newspaper and the radio. There was a journalist by the name of Carl Snyder, and he believed fiercely in the young man. He would write impassioned letters to publications on the boy's behalf, and those would get circulated among other publications. And then, of course, his opponents that did not want him to get the pardon, they would also write in and defend their reasons for not allowing the boy to have his freedom. You're seeing lots of articles, you're reading lots of editorials, people writing in. It's just all playing out in the papers. One such opponent of Wesley's early release recounted stories of the much-feared prisoner as a terror to his schoolmates and now as of his prison inmates. But Wesley himself wrote a letter denying those allegations, and he sent it to the governor. He stated that those stories were made up and outright lies. He even set the record straight on one allegation that he had killed his parents over, quote, a slight argument, unquote. Although that was what he had initially said in his confession, he now goes on to describe that he was at the mercy of beatings from his parents and much cruel treatment. He asked the paper to retract that original author's letter since it was full of falsehoods. However, the paper did not choose to print his letter of defending himself, nor did they retract the original letter of allegation.
Okay.
Not surprisingly, that petition for pardon was rejected.
So newspapers have been biased for a long time.
Yes, the media, the more we've done this, the more I see how much that media really, really plays.
It really does.
And none of it is non-biased. I used to hear that years ago the media was more non-biased than it is today, but I don't believe that.
I don't think so.
When we look back and we read some of these old accounts, I mean, that bias is very obvious, isn't it?
It's really all based on hearsay and on whatever story they decide to believe. And then I feel like once the newspapers pick it up, they have the power of persuasion over the people.
They do. And now it's now it's not just newspapers, now it's the internet.
Yeah. TikTok.
Yep. In 1897, Elkins again submitted a petition for a pardon. This time he added to it his regret for the crime, as well as his good behavior record. So his wardens did verify or confirm that he had a good behavior record. The person who said that he was a terror to his prison inmates and that kind of thing, they didn't have anything to substantiate that.
Okay, so that wasn't true.
And the wardens did not agree with that.
Okay.
And so it's interesting that those papers did choose not to write,
Right.
not to print his letter or retract the original story.
That is interesting.
He also, in his letter, offered his exceptional educational progress as proof that he was becoming a good citizen. This time, his case had gained some steam with the public, though. However, his neighbors back in Clayton County, they were not having it. They did not want to see mercy for what they thought was a deranged killer. So they sent a petitioner out to gather support for keeping him incarcerated, and they were able to garner 1,300 signatures.
Wow.
And perhaps that was due to some of the testimony that some of the neighbors had given about his early life and why they felt he had gone on that violent rampage to begin with. They just thought because of that he was predisposed to murder.
Right.
Prenatally. I think they even used the words prenatal murderer. I don't know.
Wow. Okay.
So when it was known that his method of killing his father and his alibi perfectly matched one of his mother's previous plans, good folk who lived near John Elkins, they were convinced this boy was a no-count degenerate who would not hesitate to murder again if he was given the chance. And they said, no, rehabilitation is not possible. But Wesley's case was gaining some steam, and most likely due to some of those newspaper reports that were printed by that Carl Snyder that was in his favor. Mm-hmm. Senators now were starting to pay attention. 2 clergymen from his home county who had previously been against the pardon, they now changed their stance after visiting him in prison.
Oh, wow.
In their view, if the young man could be placed under the guidance of someone trustworthy, they would no longer be against the pardon. So the tide is turning in Elkins' favor. Now, there was one concern. If he was denied this pardon, then they were worried that it would hurt any future chances he had. Mm-hmm. So they decided to pull this petition with the agreement that in 2 more years, when the General Assembly met again, they would put it forth this time. And at that time, it would have the support of legislators. They just felt like it would give him a stronger support if they would wait, get more of the public opinion in his favor, more senators in his favor, and that kind of thing.
That was smart. A smart move.
It was. When the time came at the end of 1899 for that next petition to be put forth, the new governor decided against it.
Oh.
Although Elkins had been promised that he would be supported by the legislators, the political climate was not in his favor. There was a lot of stuff going on there that affected his case, even though it didn't directly involve him. Governor Leslie Shaw was, he didn't want to make either side hostile to him. Okay. And so he wouldn't pass the petition to the General Assembly. And it was a very big disappointment to Elkin because he had been promised that it would. Governor Shaw was persuaded, however, to put forth the request for the next General Assembly in 2 more years, in 1902.
Okay.
So he kind of got caught up in a political time, and it just worked against him. Finally, in 1902, after Wesley had already served 12 years of his life sentence, more than half of his life, the Iowa legislature was given the petition for parole. Wesley himself wrote a letter, and I'm going to have it read now in his own words.
The thought of my crime is revolting to me and causes me to suffer every time I recall it. I cannot say anything to favor myself at the expense of the dead. Looking back in the light of a more mature knowledge, I believe that while many of my punishments were unjust and cruel, my parents were honest in believing themselves right and acted as they thought for my best. A lifetime of sorrowful regret cannot atone for what in charity may be called the mad act of a child. I know it is hard and difficult to get away from the thought of the crime, but I most earnestly but respectfully ask you to thoroughly investigate my conduct and prison record, my moral and intellectual advancement since being confined, and if possible, forgive in the boy that which would be unpardonable in the man. Does it not seem to you hard and cruel that for the crime of a boy of 11, the man must suffer for as long as he lives? If it can be truly shown that the boy who committed the crime is as truly dead as if he were underground, and from that life an honest and upright one has grown, is it not but plain justice that he be given what all men need sometimes, another chance? It is my earnest desire, if paroled, to be placed under the tutorage of Professor Harlan of Cornell College. I shall at all times act as he directs, and shall with tireless energy devote myself to the duties assigned to me. However drastic the conditions of my parole may be, I shall with all my strength, and to the best of my ability, endeavor to meet every condition in spirit and in death. If my life is ever to be turned into an avenue of usefulness, ought it not be now, while I am young and strong and hopeful for the future? Why not now, before the incentive to action is lacking and the spirit of ambition departs, leaving behind a weary, helpless wreck? J. Wesley Elkins.
Those were very moving words
Yes.
by young Wesley. So at this point, he was 23 years old. By this time, the public was strongly advocating for children to be treated differently under the law. Social groups were pushing for changes, voicing the idea that children are influenced by their environment and that rehabilitation for children was possible if their environment was improved. It also assisted the argument that being in an adult prison would not be helpful to rehabilitation of children who had committed horrible crimes. And yet, there was still a strong belief that criminals' minds could be rooted in biology, which is basically the same question we have today, right?
Yeah.
Are criminals born?
Right. Or are they made? And I think it also the question of, do we incarcerate people for punishment or for rehabilitation?
That is the root of the question, right?
Right.
And it's not a black and white question.
No.
It's not that simple.
There's really not. Because I think, depending on the situation, I mean, I still think criminals need to be punished for sure. But I think it depends on the crime too. This is going to sound, I don't know how it's going to sound, but I'm just going to say it anyway. A lot of times, sexual degenerates that kill for sexual motives, most of the time, they will reoffend.
I think statistically that is proven again and again.
Right. But in cases like this, I've actually seen cases recently of mothers who have killed like all of their children under, when they've gone through this, the psychosis.
Like the postpartum.
The postpartum psychosis, and were found not guilty for reason of insanity. And they would send them away for a short time and they would go back to their husbands and live normal lives. And they didn't reoffend. So I don't know.
The problem is more complex than just a simple black or white answer.
Yeah.
For
And I'm
sure.
not saying I think that they should have been allowed to go back. I'm just telling you what happened.
We're talking about factual
Yeah.
and what's happened in the past, right?
I'm saying terrible crimes because this here is a terrible
it was a
crime
brutal
that
murder.
we're talking about. Yeah.
Well, it was actually during this time that the idea of the born criminal was being studied by scientists. Could inherited mental abnormalities be passed down to the next generation in utero? And if someone was determined to be a quote-unquote born criminal, then was the only option to protect society to keep them locked up. And back then, they also thought keeping them from reproducing, because if you can pass on that gene. And you remember one of our worst cases, that Wineville chicken coop murders,
Yes.
and how that young man at the end did not want to reproduce because he was so fearful of passing down that family gene. So those questions were on the minds of scientists then, and they were studying those things. And it was questions like those that made some people believe that it would be most dangerous to release Elkins because it would put society at more danger if he should reproduce. However, in April of 1902, the General Assembly was set to hear the arguments both for and against the pardon of 22-year-old Wesley Elkins. I said earlier he was 23. He was 22. Speaking on behalf of the young man was Senator Whipple. He at first read through the terms that would apply to the pardon if it were granted. That Elkins would avoid evil associations, that he would obey all laws, and abstain from intoxicating liquors for 10 years. If he could comply, then after the 10 years, he would have a full pardon. And he then went on to outline the facts of the crime, including his early life, that of the harsh treatment by his parents, He argued that a child was not capable of reasoning like an adult under such circumstances. He also put forth that under previous legal precedents, the sentence he had been given was actually illegal and unjust. And he went on to describe the transformation of Elkins while he was in prison, his education, his good behavior, the support of the wardens and the clergymen, as we've already established. And then it was the turn of the opposing side. It was led by Senator Bishop, who spoke for the people of Clayton County. He felt the young man was not to be trusted and that the public would not be safe if he were set free. However, he did actually say that should the prisoner be granted the pardon, he himself would offer him his hand and would help him in any way if he could.
Wow.
I thought that was upstanding.
Yeah.
He gave an impassioned speech, though, outlining the grisly details of the crime. And at one point, he was so theatrical, he even brandished the club that he stated was the very one that the boy had used to bludgeon his stepmother.
Wow.
And he just said he believed someone of such degeneracy was beyond all hope of redemption. And I thought that was an interesting choice of words. Are there people who are beyond all hope of redemption?
I mean, I think we're supposed to say no, but I don't know.
No, because the easy answer for us is like, nobody's beyond the saving grace of Christ. But there are people who are not going to be redeemed, no matter what chances they are given. That's a hard conversation.
It is.
But I'm going to move on. Senator Bishop also stated somewhat contradictorily that he may be for the pardon in the future, but for now, he felt he had done what he believed to be right. So I do think he was a man of conviction.
Yeah.
I think he really did believe that Elkins would be dangerous where he let out, but he was not beyond considering it in the future, and he was not just adamant, no, 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 never.
Okay.
I think he was open to the idea that he could possibly be, although it is contradictory in that he had said he didn't think there was hope for redemption. But again, it's one of those things like you can change your mind about, like, well, maybe I do think that, or maybe I thought this then and I don't now.
It's so hard because on one hand, I think he's 11 years old. On the other hand, I think, would I want him to come live at my house?
Yeah,
No,
two very
I
different.
wouldn't.
Exactly. I wouldn't either. I would be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Especially once he's let out. He's 22 now.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, when all was said and done, the vote in the Senate was 27-20 in favor of the pardon.
Okay.
Now, the vote still has to clear the House. That was just the Senate.
Oh, okay.
It has to clear the House before it could be brought before the parole board, who would then make a decision.
And then they
So
decide.
It was a lengthy process.
It's in the beginning.
After the same arguments were repeated with the same passion, the House voted 48-35 in favor of recommending parole for Elkins.
Okay.
So they were persuaded. In mid-April 1902, Governor Cummins signed the release papers for Elkins. He had won his freedom, finally. 2 requirements were added to the already read requirements that had come with the parole. They were that he was to live in Lynn County, close to Professor Harlan, who he had become acquainted with, and he had agreed to be his guide or his mentor. He had to live close to him in Lynn County. He was not to enter Clayton County or any adjoining county to it ever again. And they said perhaps that was for his own safety as opposed to their safety. They were saying that if he came back, they were afraid he would kill them because they had been against him. But others were saying it was probably more for his safety because they were so adamant about his guilt and lack of no hope of redemption for him, so to speak. On April 19th, 1902, Wesley Elkins walked out of Anamosa State Penitentiary, a free man, wearing his new suit of clothes, a navy suit, a blue batwing tie, and a fawn-colored fedora.
Wow.
Actually, I have a picture of him. He was a very handsome young man.
Was he?
Mm-hmm. In the following years, Elkins strove to keep a low profile. He obeyed his orders, stayed with the Harlans, taken odd jobs and some classes, and in 1912, he did receive his full pardon.
Wow.
After that, when he was able to leave Harlan's charge ship, his monthly update letters to the governor stopped, and he was harder to keep track of after that.
Sure.
But we do know that he eventually moved to Honolulu, where he married at the age of 44. His wife was 29. And then they eventually moved together to San Bernardino, California, where they owned a chicken farm.
Oh, golly.
He lived to be 83 years old, and he died of heart disease after living a fairly quiet life for the remainder of his years.
I had a feeling he wasn't going to re-offend.
So here are the questions I was left with.
Okay.
I want to know what you think on some of these. Did he deserve a pardon? Is prison reform a good idea or no?
I think it depends. I definitely
depends.
think it depends. But, like, is he still dangerous? I guess to me that's it. Do I think Wesley Elkins, is he reformed? That is the question to me at
And
that point.
We have the benefit of looking back on his and saying, well, he must have been. He did not recommit any
Exactly.
crimes. I mean, like, so we can look back and say, in that case, yeah.
Yeah.
Those sure were some hard times.
Yes, they were.
Now, when I started helping my wife with this podcast, I had no idea it was going to be such a learning experience. In just the last few episodes, I've learned that when you write a poem about you and your BFF killing somebody, it does not have to be good. I've learned that sometimes all it takes to inspire a new song is somebody being killed and thrown in the river. And today I learned the real-life application to knowing how to write a good Dear Parole Board letter. So when you get done downloading every episode, you make sure you tell everybody you know, and a few people you don't, to check out Hard Times and True Crimes for educational purposes. Till next time, goodbye.